The snow had been falling for 3 days straight when Nora was left at the side of the road, like a sack of grain no one wanted anymore. Her brother-in-law had done it, Silas Greer, her late husband's younger brother. The one who'd always looked at the farm like it belonged to him by some invisible right. Had driven her out to the crossroads in his wagon before first light, set her trunk down in the snow and turned the horses around without a word. He'd waited until she was standing there, her hands shaking inside her coat, before he finally spoke. "The farm's mine now," he said. "Theodore left no proper will, you know that." "I know nothing of the sort," Nora had answered, her voice steadier than she felt. "Doesn't matter what you know." He gathered the reins. "You've got no people in Dunmore. Best move on." And he did. The wagon disappeared into the white morning, and Nora stood at that crossroads for a long time, long enough for the cold to settle into the space between her shoulder blades, long enough for the first real fear to rise in her throat. She was 31 years old. She had $17 folded inside her boot. She had a wool coat that needed restitching along the left seam, a trunk with her mother's quilts and Theodore's letters, and a child growing inside her that she hadn't yet told a soul about. She picked up the handle of the trunk and started walking. The town of Heron Creek sat 8 miles east of that crossroads, which Nora had known only from a map she'd once seen on the wall of the Dunmore post office. She had no particular reason to go there, except that it was the only town within walking distance, and she was a practical woman, even when her heart was doing things that weren't practical at all. She made it 4 miles before the trunk became too heavy. She left it behind a stand of spruce trees, marking the spot as best she could, and kept walking. The snow had softened to a fine powder that caught in her eyelashes. The road was barely visible. She kept her eyes on the dark line of the tree line on either side, and put one foot in front of the other, which was the only arithmetic that mattered. She was trying very hard not to think about Theodore. Theodore Bellum had been a quiet man, not unlike this landscape, vast and spare and better understood slowly. They'd been married 6 years. He'd died in October of a fever that came on fast and left faster, taking him with it. He'd been 42. She'd held his hand through 3 days and nights of it, and then he was simply gone, and the world had not paused even briefly to acknowledge what that meant. She was nearly at the edge of Heron Creek when she fell. The ice was hidden under a thin skin of snow, just at the edge of a shallow ditch, and her foot went out from under her before she understood what was happening. She came down hard on her left side, her hips striking the frozen ground, and she lay there for a moment, looking up at the gray sky, breathing. She tested her wrist. It was tender but not broken. Her hip would bruise dark as a storm. She was pushing herself upright when she heard the horse. It came from the north, moving at an easy pace, not fast, not slow, and she had just gotten to her feet, one hand pressing her coat against her side, when the rider came around the bend and stopped. He was a big man. That was the first thing. Not large in the way that announced itself, but large in the way of someone who'd worked hard all his life and the work had settled into him. He sat the horse, the way men sat horses, when they'd been doing it since childhood. Easy, like it cost him nothing. He had a dark coat, snow on his hat brim, and he was looking at her with an expression that was very careful and very still. He didn't say anything right away. She didn't either. "You fall?" he finally asked. "I slipped," she said. There was a brief pause. He looked at her. Not in any way that felt threatening, but the way a person looks when they're trying to understand something without asking too many questions. "You're bleeding," he said. She touched her temple. Her glove came away with a smear of red. She'd hit the edge of the ditch when she went down, must have, and hadn't felt it through the cold. "It's nothing serious," she said. He dismounted. He didn't ask her permission, didn't make a ceremony of it. He simply stepped down from the horse and pulled a cloth from his coat pocket and held it out to her. She hesitated a moment, then took it and pressed it to her temple. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "Heron Creek. That's where I'm headed." He glanced at the road behind her, then back. "You come far?" Far enough. He studied her face with those careful eyes. She got the impression he was a man who didn't press, who understood that answers came when people were ready to give them and not a moment before. "My name is Doyle Marsh," he said. "Nora Bellum," she said. He nodded, once, as if that settled something. Then he said, "You can ride if you want. I'll walk." She almost said no. She was used to managing her own way. Theodore had loved that about her, or so he'd said, and she'd believed him. But her hip was throbbing now, and the town was still a distance off, and the cloth against her temple was filling up faster than she liked. "All right," she said. He helped her up without making anything of it, and she was grateful for that. Doyle Marsh didn't talk much on the road into Heron Creek, which suited Nora fine. What he did was watch the road and keep the horse to a careful pace over the ice. Once, when the wind picked up and she pulled her coat tighter, he unrolled a wool blanket from behind the saddle and passed it back to her without turning around. She took it. She learned the shape of him in that quiet. The way he checked the tree line out of habit. The slight tilt of his head when something caught his attention. The way he never moved quickly, but never wasted a movement either. She had the feeling he'd lived alone a long time. Not the sad kind of alone, but the settled kind. The kind where a person has made a certain peace with their own company. He brought her to the door of the only boarding house in Heron Creek, a narrow white building with a green-painted porch run by a woman named Mrs. Holt, who was small and broad-shouldered and asked no unnecessary questions, which Nora also appreciated. "She's had a fall," Doyle said to Mrs. Holt. "Her head needs looking at." Mrs. Holt looked at Nora with the brisk, assessing gaze of a woman who had seen things. "Come inside," she said. Nora turned to thank Doyle, but he was already leading the horse away down the street, his broad back disappearing into the snow. She stayed 3 nights at Mrs. Holt's. The cut on her temple was shallow but had bled impressively. Mrs. Holt cleaned it with a sureness that suggested experience and pronounced it not serious. Nora's hip was every color it had promised to be. On the second day, she walked the length of the town's main street. Slowly, one hand occasionally finding a fence post, taking stock. Heron Creek was not large. A grain elevator, a feed store, a blacksmith's, a dry goods store run by a man named Albrecht who had kind eyes and prices that seemed fair. A church. A school that looked as though it might also serve as a meeting hall. 2 saloons which she noted and filed away. A land office. She went into the land office on the 3rd morning. The man behind the desk looked up with the mild interest of someone who expected to be surprised. He was not young. "I'd like to know," Nora said carefully, "about a man named Silas Greer who operates the Greer Bellum farm in the Dunmore district." The man's expression shifted just slightly. "You've got business with Greer?" "I had business with the farm," she said. "My name is Nora Bellum. My husband Theodore Bellum owned half that land." There was a long pause. "I think," the man said, "you'd want to speak with a solicitor." "I intend to," Nora said. "I wanted to understand what I was looking at first." He looked at her steadily for a moment. Then he pulled a ledger from the shelf behind him and set it on the desk. She saw Doyle Marsh again on the 4th day outside the feed store. He was loading sacks onto a wagon, and he glanced up when she passed and nodded, the same careful nod as before. "How's your head?" he asked. "Better," she said. "Thank you for the other day." He looked at her the way he'd looked at her on the road. That same unhurried attention. "You found somewhere to stay?" "Mrs. Holt's. For now." He went back to loading the sacks. She had the impression the conversation wasn't over, exactly, but that he wasn't going to push it. She was almost past the wagon when he said, "There's work at the Albrecht store, I heard. If you're looking." She stopped. "How'd you know I was looking?" He thought about that. "Just seemed likely," he said. She almost smiled. "Thank you," she said again. He nodded and lifted another sack. She went to Albrecht's that same afternoon. The man with the kind eyes turned out to have a wife who was ill and a store that needed more hands than he currently had, and he gave Nora a trial week at a wage that was honest. She started the next morning. She was good at the work. She'd kept books for Theodore's farm for years, and she understood inventory. And she was quick with numbers, and she didn't make small talk when small talk wasn't warranted. By the end of the trial week, Albrecht told her the job was hers as long as she wanted it. She thanked him and went back to the boarding house and sat on the edge of her bed and let herself, finally, feel some of the weight come off. She was going to be all right. She didn't know yet what all right would look like, but she was going to be it. She pressed her hand flat against her middle. 5 months, she reckoned. Maybe less. I know, she said quietly, to no one but the room and the person she was carrying in it. I know, we'll figure it out. The weeks moved. The snow kept falling and the days shortened and Heron Creek settled into its winter rhythms. Nora settled into hers. She saw Doyle Marsh from time to time. He came into Albrecht's for supplies every week or so, regular as a tide. And they talked briefly, the way people in small towns talk when they've decided they don't mind each other. He'd had a farm north of town, she learned, for going on 15 years. Before that he'd been in the Northwest Territories, which he said with the particular flatness of a man who'd been somewhere that took something from him and wasn't going to elaborate. He'd been married once. His wife's name had been May. He didn't say what happened, only that it was a long time ago. And the way he said it told her all she needed to know about how much it still wasn't. He didn't ask her about Theodore. She was grateful for that too. What he did, slowly and without announcement, was begin to help her. It wasn't grand. It wasn't the kind of help that came with expectations attached. It was the kind of help that arrived quietly and was simply there. A cord of firewood stacked outside the boarding house one morning with no note. A jar of preserved plums left with Mrs. Holt from his larder, he said, when she mentioned offhand that she'd been missing fruit. When the temperature dropped hard in December, and the boarding house furnace struggled, he came by with his toolbox and fixed the flue in 2 hours without being asked. Nora watched all of this and said very little about it. She had learned to be careful with gratitude, to receive it without making too much of it in either direction. She thanked him each time, plainly and directly, and he nodded each time in his particular way, as though that was all that was required. But she watched him. She noticed that he was not, in fact, a simple man. He was a quiet man, which is different. He read. She'd seen books on the seat of his wagon, once a worn copy of something she recognized as Tennyson. He listened to people with the same unhurried attention he'd given her on the road that first day, and she observed that people told him things they might not have told someone who asked more. He had an opinion about everything but volunteered almost none of them, which was a form of discipline she respected. She began to understand that what she'd taken initially for simplicity was actually stillness. He'd been through enough that he didn't need to fill the air to feel real. That was in January. In February, Silas Greer came to Heron Creek. She was at the counter in Albrecht's when she heard the bell above the door, and she looked up out of habit, and there he was. He was shorter than she remembered. That was always the way, she thought, with men who'd loomed large in your worst moments. He stood in the doorway with snow on his shoulders and a look on his face she recognized, the look of a man who'd come to manage something unpleasant and was telling himself it wasn't personal. "Nora," he said. "Silas," she said. Albrecht at the back of the store had gone very still. Silas came to the counter. He was, she noticed, alone. He had the look of a man who'd expected more fear and was recalibrating. "I heard you were here," he said. "Figured I'd come speak to you directly." "I appreciate that," she said, which was not true, but she wasn't going to hand him anything. "I don't want there to be bad feelings," he said, which was almost funny, but she kept her face composed. "I've spoken with a solicitor," she said, "about Theodore's estate." The look shifted. Something closed behind his eyes. "Is that right?" "I have a copy of Theodore's letter," she said. "Not a will, a letter written in his hand 6 months before he died. That sets out his intentions very clearly. The solicitor believes a court would consider it compelling." She watched him process this. She had, in fact, spent considerable time in November and December corresponding with a solicitor in Dunmore, a careful woman named Mrs. Aldercott who had reviewed the letter and used that exact word. Compelling. You'd drag this through a court, Silas said. I'd do what needs to be done, she said. For myself and for the child. That landed. She watched it land. She hadn't planned to tell him, but sometimes information was a tool and you used the tools you had. His face went through several things in quick succession. She stood very still and let it. There's no, he began. It's Theodore's, she said, quietly. Finally. Silence. The bell above the door rang again and Doyle Marsh came in. He stopped when he took in the scene, quickly, accurately, the way he took in everything, and looked at Nora with a question in his eyes. She gave him the smallest shake of her head. Not yet. He went to the shelf on the far wall and began looking at harness oil, with a focus that was obviously manufactured, and she felt something in her chest unclench slightly, knowing he was there. I came to make an offer, Silas said at last. His voice had changed, something harder underneath it now, but controlled. Then make it, she said. He named a figure. It was low, but it was not nothing. I'll take that under advisement, she said. You'll have an answer by the end of the month, through the solicitor. He looked at her for a long moment, then he looked past her at Doyle, who did not turn, who went on studying harness oil with that manufactured interest, and something in Silas's expression shifted again, recalibrated again. End of the month, he said. Thank you for coming, she said, which was also not true, but she said it in a tone that closed the door, and he left. She stood very still for a moment after the bell rang. Then Doyle came to the counter. You all right? He said. Yes, she said. And then, because it was Doyle and he wouldn't make anything of it. I'm angry. That's fair, he said. He came here thinking I'd be frightened, she said. He came here expecting to manage me. Doyle looked at her steadily. Doesn't seem like it worked, he said. She let out a breath that was almost a laugh. Silas's offer. After consultation with Mrs. Aldercott and a great deal of careful thinking, she accepted. Not because it was fair. It was not. But because a court case would take years and cost money she didn't have, and she was running out of time. She settled for enough to see her through, enough to matter. It wasn't justice. It was pragmatic, which sometimes was what you had. The money arrived in March and she paid Mrs. Holt through spring and wrote to Mrs. Aldercott a letter of genuine thanks. She did not tell Doyle the specific terms. She told him it was resolved. Good, he said. That was all he said, and it was the right amount. Her daughter was born on a Tuesday in late March, during a thaw that turned the main street of Heron Creek to mud, and sent the creek itself running high and bright. She'd planned for it as best she could. Mrs. Holt had a cousin who'd midwifed half the county, a forthright woman named Patience who arrived promptly and was exactly as her name suggested. The labor was long but not dangerous, Patience said, and Nora believed her, or tried to, through the hours of it. She named the girl May. She hadn't planned to. She'd had a list of names. Her mother's name, Theodore's mother's name, a few others she'd always liked. But when she held the baby for the first time, a red-faced, furious, astonishing creature, none of those names fit. May fit. She lay in her room at the boarding house with the baby on her chest, and the March light coming through the window, and she thought about Doyle's wife who had died, and what it meant to carry a name forward, and whether it was overstepping, to want to honor something she understood only in outline. She decided it wasn't. She'd tell him, when it felt right. She told him in April, when he came to Albrecht's for supplies and stopped at the counter and asked how the baby was doing. She's doing well, Nora said. I named her May. He went very still. It was not a bad still. She'd learned to read his stillness. This one was internal. The kind that happened when something reached further in than expected. I hope that's all right, she said carefully. I didn't know her, but from what you've said, the little you've said, it felt like the right name for a girl I want to be fierce and good. He looked down at the counter, back up at her. It's more than all right, he said. His voice was level, but she heard something behind it. Okay, she said. Thank you, he said. Okay, she said again softly. They stood there a moment, neither of them making anything of it, which was, she thought, exactly right. Spring opened the land up, the mud dried, the creek settled, the fields north of town turned from gray to the tentative green of early growth, and Doyle Marsh came less often to Albrecht's because the farm was demanding all of him, the way farms did in spring. She missed him when she let herself notice. It wasn't a complicated missing. It was the kind that came from having found, in a difficult season, someone whose company was genuinely good and whose absence made things quieter in a way she hadn't been expecting. Baby May was a creature of strong opinions and loud announcements. Mrs. Holt had developed an affection for her that expressed itself in practical and persistent ways. Extra portions, warm baths, the offer of the larger room at no extra cost. Nora accepted some of it and not all of it, because she was still learning how to receive things, which was harder than it looked. She was weighing whether she could afford to put her name on a small piece of land at the edge of town. Not a farm, nothing that grand, just a place that was hers. When Doyle came back in May, he came on a Wednesday in the late afternoon, when the light was that specific gold that happened for about 40 minutes each spring day before it went blue and cool. He came into Albrecht's, and he didn't look at the shelves. He came directly to the counter. She looked up. "I have something I want to say," he said, "and I'm not good at this kind of thing, so I'd ask you to just let me get through it." She set down what she was doing. "All right," she said. "I've been thinking about this since February," he said. "Maybe longer. I think you're one of the finest people I've met in a long time. And I know you've been through a great deal and you're not looking for anything to complicate things." He stopped, regrouped. It's a good farm, good land. It needs more than one person, maybe. And May is." He paused again. "May is a name I'm glad to hear again. I'm glad you gave it to her." She waited. "I'm not asking for anything fast," he said. "I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give. I'm just telling you that I'd like very much for you and May to come out to the farm, for supper, when you're ready. And then, whatever comes after that, at whatever pace makes sense." The gold light was in the window behind him, catching the dust motes. She thought about Theodore. She thought about the crossroads in the snow, and the trunk she'd left under the spruce trees, and the long walk that had brought her here. She thought about what it meant to start again. Not to replace something, but to build something different on the ground of what had been. She thought about Doyle sitting a horse in a blizzard and handing her a cloth for her bleeding head without making anything of it. She thought about firewood appearing without notes and plum preserves from a winter larder and a man reading Tennyson on the seat of a wagon. Thursday would work, she said, for supper. Something in his face shifted, very slightly. The way things shifted in him. Internal, quiet, genuine. "Thursday," he said. "May has opinions about food," she said. "I'm warning you now." "I'll take that under advisement," he said, which was almost exactly what she'd said to Silas in February, and the fact that he used those words felt like something, like a small private joke between two people who'd been paying attention. "Good," she said. He nodded. He gathered himself to go. At the door, he paused. "The trunk you left by the spruce trees," he said. "On the road outside town." She stared at him. "How did you?" "I went back for it," he said simply. "The day after I brought you in. It's in my barn. Been there since October." She couldn't speak for a moment. "I didn't know if you'd want it mentioned," he said. "Didn't want to assume." "Doyle," she said. "Nora," he said, which was just her name. But the way he said it was different from how he'd said it on the road. It had something in it now, weight and warmth both. "Thursday," she said again. "Thursday," he agreed. He walked out into the gold afternoon, and she stood at the counter and watched him go, and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not the end of grief, not the reversal of what had happened, but the particular, fragile, true feeling of a door opening. Baby May, in the back room, announced her opinions on the matter loudly. Nora laughed, for the first time in a long time, without anything complicated behind it. She went to pick up her daughter. and outside the window the light went blue and cool, and somewhere, north of town, the farm waited in its spring green, quiet and real, belonging to someone who understood that the best things came slowly and without ceremony, and were worth every bit of the wait.